네, 이제 10시 반이 되어서 저희 행사 시작하고자 합니다. 저희 서울대학교 중앙도서관과 옥스퍼드 유니버시티 대학 출판부에서 함께 진행하는 저자 워크숍에 참석해 주셔서 모두 감사드립니다. 우선 제가 사회자분을 간단하게 이제 소개해 드리고자 하는데요. 저희 옥스퍼드 대학 출판부에서 학술분과를 담당하고 계신 정원일 선생님이십니다. 정원일 선생님께서 오늘 이어질 강연을 진행해 주실 예정이고요. 네, 박수로 모시도록 하겠습니다.
네, 안녕하십니까. 옥스퍼드 대학 출판부 한국지사에서 온 정원일입니다. 저는 옥스퍼드 대학 출판부 한국지사에서 그 아카데믹 디비전의 비즈니스 총괄을 맡고 있고요. 그렇습니다. 저희 회사 소개를 간단하게 하면 저희 회사는 약 600년의 역사를 가지고 있습니다. 보면 조선시대 성종 때부터 시작되는 출판사라고 할 수 있습니다. 현재로서 약 400개의 국제 학술지를 출판을 하고 있고요. 한국에서는 교육부에서 지원을 받는 3대 출판사 중에 하나입니다. 오늘은 How to Publish with OUP라는 주제를 가지고 할 거고요. 강사는 매튜 레인이라고 시니어 에디터가 진행할 예정입니다. 많은 도움이 되시기를 바라고요. 그러면은 이제 강사를 불러보도록 하겠습니다. Over to you, Matthew.
Thank you, Juan. And thank you all for coming along today. As Juan just explained, I'm Matthew Lane and I am a senior editor based in the Oxford University Press, or OUP, Journals Department, and I'm based in our Tokyo office. And I'm responsible for managing a list of around just under 20 journals, which we publish in partnership with Japanese learned societies, such as the Japanese Biochemical Society, Japanese Society for Immunology, and so on. And I also actually manage one journal here in Korea, which we publish in partnership with the Society for Computational Design and Engineering. And actually the editor-in-chief is based here at SNU. So in this presentation, I'm going to give an overview of the process of getting your paper published in an OUP journal. And I'm going to talk about some of the specific services that OUP offers, but most of what I talk about will be relevant to any journal published by any publisher. So hopefully it will be useful information for you when you're submitting papers or thinking about where to submit your papers in the future. So the structure of the presentation basically follows the publication of a research paper, from preparing your manuscript through the submission and peer review process, production, and then finally to promoting your article once it's online. But first of all, I'd like to start with an introduction to OUP and our journal's publishing program in general. So OUP is a department of the University of Oxford, and this fact kind of shapes the sort of organization that we are and the kind of values that we have. And of course, we are predominantly an academic and educational publisher. We are, in fact, the largest university press in the world. And all of the profits that we make from publishing goes into research and scholarship via the Oxford University. So all of our profits we give to Oxford University, and they use that for giving scholarships, grants, and supporting research in other ways. So in this sense, we are a kind of mission-driven publisher, and you can see our mission statement here on the slide. I think this is an important distinction when compared to our most of our competitors, whose publishing activities basically create profits which go to company shareholders. Another key difference between OUP and most of our competitors is that we are predominantly a society journal publisher. So I mentioned that I work together with Japanese societies. In fact, around 80% of all of our journals are published in partnership with learned societies. And we publish somewhere between 450 and 500 journals, something like that. It's growing every year. And around 25% of our journals are fully open access journals. So we publish subscription journals and open access journals. Working with so many societies means that we need to work in a way which meets the needs of our societies. And this in turn helps us to focus on delivering a high quality service to our authors and our readers and our society partners. And as this quote says at the bottom of the slide, we are, I guess, the only publisher that combines a kind of global scale of business, but with a sort of bespoke, flexible service to authors, which comes through our kind of ethos of working with societies and managing their brand and sort of preserving their identity. Okay, so before submitting to an OUP journal, I would definitely recommend visiting our Author Resources Centre. And you can find a whole load of different resources on, for example, how to prepare and submit your manuscript, publishing ethics, OUP's general publishing policies, licensing and publication charges, how to clear permissions for copyrighted work, which is very useful, and how to promote your article once it's published. And I mentioned before that, well, just now, that we like to preserve the individual identity of the journals that we publish. And sort of one aspect of that is that each journal is allowed to set is able to set its own kind of publishing policies and style. So it's very important when you're submitting to an OUP journal to check the author guidelines of the individual journal to make sure you fully understand what the journal's policies are. And the author guidelines can always be found on an OUP journal homepage under this submit menu here. Okay, so let's start at the beginning of the publication process, which is preparing your manuscript for submission. And this slide shows the key sections that should be included in a typical research paper. And the tips below each of these sections are not specific to OUP, they would apply to any journal. And following this advice will help the editorial team at the journal you're submitting to make a quick assessment of whether your paper is suitable for their journal. The abstract is, of course, very important. This should state the background information, any knowns or unknowns, your scientific question or hypothesis, a brief summary of the main findings, making sure to avoid technical jargon, and it should also give the take-home message of the paper, the wider significance of the work. And this is obviously a lot to get into 450 words or whatever it is, so it's important to be concise. And one thing I think is not always well understood is the importance of a good title. As it says on the slide, titles should be concise and to the point, but it's important to remember that a research paper should be telling a story. And like a magazine article or a newspaper article, the title should be catchy. It should aim to attract the attention and the interest of the reader, and it should aim to capture the essence of the story. It's also good practice to include as many keywords as you can in the title, as this will help to make it more discoverable once the paper is published online. So as well as the basic elements which make up the main body of the paper, there are some additional elements which are typically required by most journals. These usually go at the end of the paper, so they are sometimes referred to as back matter. And of these, obviously references will be required for any research paper, but some of these elements may or may not be required depending on the journal. For example, many journals these days require authors to submit a data availability statement. That's here. And the data availability statement is a statement which tells readers where they can find the data which is underlying the research paper. Figures also very important. The figure quality can really lift a paper above other papers. So it's important to think carefully about how many to include, the design of the figures, and the story you want them to tell. It's also good to make sure that the labeling is neat and consistent, and that the figures are generally neatly presented without lots of blank space. And there are guidelines for preparing figures in the Author Resources Center that I just showed you a link to on the OUP website, and it applies to all OUP journals. But again, it's important to check the individual journal author guidelines for specific requirements. Many of OUP's journals these days ask for graphical abstracts. They either recommend or require graphical abstracts. And these are, in addition to the regular text abstract. So a single figure which kind of encapsulates the whole essence of the paper. So it's important to check the guidelines to see whether those sorts of things are required. So I mentioned before about data availability statements. At OUP, we're very keen to promote open science and the open sharing of data. And as part of that, in the last few years, we have introduced a set of 4 different data policy levels, which most OUP journals have adopted. The level 1 policy is the least strict, and this just recommends that authors make their data available where ethically possible. With the level 2 policy, however, authors are required to include a data availability statement in their paper. Now, this could just be a statement saying, the data is available upon request, or it could be a statement which includes a link to an online data repository where the data is stored. The level 3 policy requires all authors to make their data available as a condition of publication. And the level 4 policy requires authors to submit their research data alongside their paper for peer review. So currently, most OUP journals adopt either the level 1 or 2 policy, but the trend in STM subjects is increasingly towards open data. So I think we can expect more journals to have higher level policies in the future. And also, just to say that other publishers have these kinds of data policies too. It's not unique to OUP. So it's always worth checking on the journal's author guidelines whether there is a data policy, whether it requires you to submit a statement. And if you're not sure how to write a data availability statement, there are a couple of links here to a page on the OUP website which has lots of sample or example statements which you can adapt. And there is also a list of online repositories if you need help finding one. So here are some other things to consider at manuscript preparation stage. I won't go into each one of these in detail, but I think it's worth talking about authorship, as this can be a problematic area. So in terms of dealing with publication ethics and problems with publication ethics, the most common issues that journal editors face is problems around authorship and author disputes. And sometimes it can be genuinely difficult to decide if someone qualifies as an author. For example, they may have done some data analysis or drafted some of the text, but are they an author? Should they be credited as a co-author or not? Sometimes it's not clear. And some journals publish their own authorship criteria, but many don't. So if you are ever in doubt, one place to go is the International Council of Medical Journal Editors guidelines on authorship, which they publish on their website. And there's a link to that on this slide. And they have a set of 4 very clear criteria as to what constitutes authorship. And although these criteria were set up by medical editors, they are in fact used across the journal's publishing industry in all subject areas now as the kind of gold standard of what defines authorship. So if you are ever in any doubt, if you refer to those, you can't really go wrong. And please note, in addition to that as a general rule, authors are not permitted to be added or removed after a paper has been submitted. It can be done in some exceptional cases, but it requires work on behalf of the journal editor. All of the co-authors have to be contacted to get their approval, and it's very troublesome. So please consider in advance who qualifies for the author list and make sure that it's accurate when you submit your paper. Another point to highlight is language editing. So if you're submitting to an OUP journal, it will be an English language paper, which, and English, I guess, for most of you or all of you, possibly is not your native language. And I myself have lived in Japan for 15 years, and I consider that I have a fairly high level of Japanese language ability, but I would still struggle to write a research paper in Japanese. And in fact, I am always amazed that Japanese and Korean researchers are able to write papers in English. I think it's incredible. That said, however good your English is, you should always, if possible, talk to a native speaker, ask a native speaker to check your paper. There is no shame in it, and it is highly recommended, because journal editors will sometimes overlook or even reject papers, even if they are scientifically sound with no problems, just because of poor language. And I guess sometimes a bit of a misunderstanding is that during the production process, papers will be copy edited. There will be, at the copy editing stage, minor grammatical errors and typos will be fixed, but copy editors don't rewrite papers. So there is an expectation that the English should be good, at the point that you submit the manuscript. So if you're not confident of your English ability, or you don't have a native English speaker that you can ask to check the paper, there are also specialist language editing services available. And one such service is Enago. And in fact, OUP has a partnership with Enago, which means that authors can get a 30% discount on their language editing services. And as you can see from this slide, there's a special co-branded Enago and OUP webpage, which can be viewed in multiple languages, including Korean. And authors who request editing services through this page will get a 30% discount. And as of the beginning of this year, Enago are also offering discounted services, other discounted services, such as creating graphical abstracts and video abstracts. And also they can write regular text abstracts and lay summaries. So all of these services are available on the website. So I talked a moment ago about authorship and ensuring that authors are credited correctly. One particularly hot topic in relation to this is the use and future role of AI in research and creating research papers. And as I'm sure you're all aware, this has become a particularly hot topic because of the release of ChatGPT towards the end of last year. ChatGPT is a natural language processing tool, or chatbot, which is driven by AI technology. And this synthesizes multiple sources of information to provide linguistically sophisticated answers to difficult questions. And there are many ways in which AI technology can potentially enhance research and even scholarly publishing in the future. But I think one of the main concerns at the moment within the publishing industry is the use of ChatGPT as an author. And one of the main criteria that I mentioned about the ICMJE sort of criteria for authorship is that authors should be able to take responsibility for their work. An AI chatbot is obviously not a legal entity, so it can't hold copyright, and it can't defend its work in court. So it should never be listed as an author for those reasons alone. Another point is, depending on how you use it, ChatGPT doesn't really create new ideas, it synthesizes existing material. And it's not really clear how much ChatGPT paraphrases or rewrites the text that it's drawing from. So if you use text generated by ChatGPT in a paper, it could leave you open to the risk of plagiarism, even if you don't intend it to. And there have also been doubts raised about ChatGPT's source material. So for these reasons, OUP does not allow ChatGPT or other chatbots to be listed as authors, and our production department actually screens papers to make sure this isn't happening. Of course, there are legitimate uses of AI in research, and authors who have used AI in their research are expected to explain how they've used the AI and what AI tool or software they have used in their cover letter and in the paper itself. So this is OUP's position, but I think it's fairly typical of the general position of publishers across the journals publishing industry. So now that the manuscript is ready, it's time to select which journal to submit to. So what do you base your decision on? At OUP, we regularly survey our authors to rank the factors that determine their choice of journal. And on this graph, you can see the average score for each of the categories listed in the legend and the trend over time. And you can see it's very consistent. The top three factors for choosing a journal are the journal brand or reputation, whether the journal reaches the right audience, and the journal's impact factor. So these are some of the things you're likely to consider when you're thinking about which journal to submit to. But I guess aiming for the most famous journal in the field or aiming for the journal with the highest impact factor might not necessarily be the best option for you, particularly if you're at an early stage in your career. So it's a good idea to draw up a short list of target journals based on the scope of your paper and the types of articles considered by the journal. And it's also worth considering, of course, your personal preferences, such as the publication model, the speed of publication, and the peer review process. If you're in a hurry to get your research published, for example, you might prefer to submit to a journal which has a publishing model where the accepted manuscript is published online ahead of the final version of the paper. If you look on the journal websites, you can also sometimes see the peer-reviewed speeds, so this can help you make a judgment on how quickly your paper is likely to be turned around. And also choosing a more specialist journal, which is specific to your field, could result in faster publication. So the readership may be narrower than a kind of large, well-known generalist journal, but you will potentially meet more of the right people in the field and have more impact with your paper, even if the impact factor of the journal is not so high. So it's worth looking at the journal website and author guidelines to try and find out this kind of useful information to help you make your selection. And here are some more detailed tips on selecting your journal for submission. Obvious journals to consider, first of all, are journals that you yourself read, and of course, journals that you have cited in your paper. As mentioned before, though, you should consider your personal situation and your personal preferences. Another thing to be aware of, which is very important, is that some journals charge publication fees. So most open access journals, almost all open access journals, will charge an article processing charge or an APC. But even some non-open access journals, subscription journals, charge publication fees such as page charges. So it's very important to check the journal website to make sure that that you understand what the charges are and if you're able to pay them. And over the past decade, actually, there's been an increase in so-called predatory journals. And these are journals which are not academically rigorous, and their aim is to take money from authors without really providing the services that the authors need. Of course, none of OUP's journals are predatory journals, but if you are considering submitting to a journal and you've maybe not heard of the publisher or you're a bit unsure about them, we can recommend using the free online Think, Check, Submit service. And this is a service which is available in multiple languages, including Korean, and it's basically just a checklist which helps you make a logical assessment as to whether the journal you're considering is trustworthy or not. And predatory journals are generally open access, as they make their money by charging APCs to authors. So a good place to check whether an open access journal is trustworthy is the Directory of Open Access Journals, or DOAJ. And the DOAJ has very strict criteria for indexing journals, and they regularly ask publishers to reapply by providing new information. So you can be assured that you can be sure that any journals indexed here on the DOAJ have very high ethical and academic standards. And OUP indexes all its open access journals in the DOAJ. And this is just an example. This is the entry for the Journal of Computational Design and Engineering, which is the one I mentioned before, which we publish here in Seoul. And you can see it includes information about the article processing charge and so on. So now you've selected your journal and you're almost ready to submit. This slide summarizes the points to check and be aware of before you actually submit the paper. And I've covered most of these already, so I won't go into detail about them, but you can refer to these later if any of them are helpful for you. One thing that is worth mentioning is format-free submission. And this is something that journals are increasingly offering, and OUP is sort of actively encouraging our publishing partners to introduce. And journals which offer format-free submission basically allow journals to submit, authors to submit papers in any journal style. So in the past, there were used to be very kind of very complex and rigorous requirements about the font size, the size of the margins, and so on. But people now kind of understand that this places a burden on the authors, particularly if authors are being rejected from multiple journals and having to constantly reformat their papers. So increasingly, journals are saying at the initial submission stage, it's fine to publish, to submit the paper in any journal format. And then if the paper gets to the revision stage or acceptance stage, that's when the authors can reformat to the journal style. So journals which offer this option will have information about this on their author guidelines page. I guess one thing to note is that even journals which offer format-free submission, they will expect the paper to be in a conventional research paper style. So they will still expect to see an abstract, a title, author list, etc. And there may also be elements such as the data availability statement, which they still require at initial submission. Another thing that is worth focusing on is the cover letter. And actually, a few years ago, one of the journals that I manage gave a workshop like this to young researchers, and the editor-in-chief actually did a whole presentation on writing a good cover letter. So it's clearly an important thing for editors when reviewing papers. And he said that when he looks at a new submission, the first thing that he looks at in this order are 1, the title and the abstract, 2, the figures and the tables, 3, the cover letter, and then finally 4, the main text of the paper. So the cover letter clearly plays a kind of important role in setting the initial impression of your paper. And the main aim when you're writing the cover letter should be to explain to the editor why your paper is suitable for the journal and the journal's readers. It's a bit like, I guess, a job application. So if you're applying for several jobs, you may not change your resume, but you would change the cover letter for each individual employer to say why you're suitable for that specific job or specific company. And this slide shows that the main points to include: you should summarize the work and also explain the significance of the findings. What is the context? How does the work help advance the field or the specific issue you're addressing? If there is a preprint version of the paper or any other work that is related that you have published elsewhere or submitted elsewhere, this should be included in the cover letter so that there is no kind of concerns about self-plagiarism or duplicate submission or anything like that in the future. And this actually applies as well to papers that have been published in Korean. So it's worth noting that. You should explain why the work is relevant and of interest to the readers of the specific journal. And then some journals allow authors to recommend reviewers or suggest reviewers for their paper. If the journal policy allows that, then that's where you can include that information. You can recommend specific reviewers, but you should always give a reason why you're recommending those reviewers so that editors are confident that you're doing it for the right reasons. And nearly all journals these days use an online submission system, such as Scholar One or Editorial Manager, which you may have heard of or even used. And the submission site for OUP journals can be accessed via the Submit menu, which is on the same place on every OUP journal homepage. And if you're using a journal submission site for the first time, you'll need to create a new account. ORCID registration is highly recommended. All OUP journals support the use of ORCID. So in case you're not familiar with ORCID, they are unique IDs that researchers can use to identify themselves and to create an online profile to which they can link all of their papers, books, conference abstracts, and so on. And ORCIDs can also be used by reviewers to get recognition for their review work. If you include an ORCID when you submit the manuscript, the ORCID will be included on the published version of the paper as a clickable link. And the paper will also be automatically added to your online ORCID profile. Some OUP journals actually require it, have made it mandatory to submit an ORCID at submission stage. So if you don't already have one, don't be put off by that. It's free to register. It's very easy, only takes a couple of minutes. Okay, so you've submitted the manuscript and it's now been received by the editorial office. What generally happens at this point is the editorial office will check the paper to see if the formatting is correct, or if it's a format-free paper, they'll check that it's just a regular research paper. And then often the editorial office will run a plagiarism check. And there's a tool on Scholar One and Editorial Manager called Authenticate, which is basically a plagiarism detection software tool. And they'll run this check to see if there is any overlap between the submitted paper and anything that's published online. So if you published a preprint version of your paper, it will show up in this Authenticate report, which is why it's good to mention it in advance in the cover letter. Assuming there are no problems with the paper, the editorial office will assign it to an editor, and then they will begin the peer review process. And this slide shows the sort of typical peer review workflow. Most journals will have this kind of workflow or some sort of variation of it. And of course, a lot of papers are instantly rejected, and this can happen for a number of different reasons. The main one is usually because the paper is out of scope for the journal, so it's not suitable for the readership. And this is why it's a good idea to think about which journals you're submitting to and select them carefully, and also to explain clearly in the cover letter to the editor why the paper is suitable. Another reason is if the paper is poorly presented or it has a lot of grammatical errors. As I mentioned before, papers which are scientifically sound are sometimes rejected or overlooked because of this, problems which are easily solvable with the English. And some journals just get huge numbers of submissions, so they're looking for reasons to reject papers. If you have a poorly presented paper or one with lots of grammatical errors, it makes your paper an easy target for immediate rejection. Manuscripts which are not instantly rejected will go on to be peer reviewed, usually by 2 or 3 peer reviewers. Okay. Thanks. So editors will send the paper to be reviewed, and they'll be reviewed by 2 to 3 peer reviewers. And then depending on what the peer reviewers come back with in their reports, the editor will then make a decision to accept or reject or request a revision. And if they request a revision, then obviously you revise the paper, resubmit it, and it gets reviewed again. So there are various different types of peer review model. The most commonly used is known as single blind peer review or anonymized peer review. And this is where the author's identity is known to editors and reviewers, but the reviewer's identity is hidden from the author. But these days there is an increasing move towards non-anonymized or open forms of peer review. So that's when the editor and reviewer know each other's identity, as well as transparent peer review, which is where the peer review reports are published alongside the final published paper. I won't go into any more detail about that, but just to say that the peer review model will always be described in the author guidelines page of the journal. So it's good to check in advance to see, to make sure you understand what peer review model the journal uses. As you may know, manuscripts are almost never accepted first time round. There's always at least one round of revision. And this is actually a kind of a good thing in a way. This is where the true value of peer review lies. It's there to make the paper better. And this is a good thing to keep in mind when responding to reviewer comments, because it may feel like they're just there trying to pick holes in your work. But actually addressing these points will help improve your work. So for this reason, you should take time to understand the reviewer's comments, and if you feel yourself getting angry or frustrated by them, then maybe leave it and come back the next day when you're feeling a bit calmer. And when you come to revise the paper, you should address each point systematically, even if you're disagreeing with the reviewers. And it's also important to be humble. If you feel that the reviewers have misunderstood what you're trying to say, then don't blame the reviewers. Think about your own paper. Is there something wrong with the way you've written it? Could you improve the explanation? But don't be afraid to challenge the reviewers' points if you feel that they are genuinely wrong. Sometimes peer reviewers make mistakes too. No one's perfect, so it's good to remember to keep a sort of calm and professional, polite tone. And probably the hardest part of the whole publication process is dealing with rejections after peer review. And the main message is to not be too disheartened or depressed. As I said, there are lots of reasons why journals reject papers, and it's not necessarily because there is a major flaw with your paper. It's sometimes to do with the paper not being right for the journal. Maybe the paper you've written is too specialized. But before rushing to submit the manuscript to another journal, it is worth looking at the points that the editor or reviewers have raised, because by addressing these points, you may be able to improve your paper and improve your chances of getting accepted the next time round. It might also be worth reconsidering your title, abstract, or cover letter, as you may not be really selling the key points of your research as effectively as you can. But then sometimes it's just also a case of luck, really. One of the things that I do in my job is I do kind of what's called rejection analysis on journals. And this is where we track all of the papers that have been rejected from a journal to see where they went on to be published and how well cited they were. And we always find a few papers that have been rejected but cited really well in another journal. Nobody is perfect, and papers sometimes just get overlooked, or the significance of their findings is not understood at the time by the editor or reviewer, and it can just be a case of bad luck. So the main thing is not to be disheartened and to think positively about how you can improve your chances the next time round. So if your paper is accepted for publication, this is the production process you can expect to go through. Journals have different methods for processing accepted papers, but this is the typical kind of workflow. And the first thing that happens with an OUP journal is that you receive a welcome email, which invites you to sign your publication license online. And the email will include a link to the online licensing and payment system. And this is a very important step to go through, because if you don't select a publishing license, your paper won't be published. So after your manuscript has been copy edited and typeset, you will receive proofs of your paper. And this will usually happen around 2 weeks after your paper's been accepted. So in the past, I guess authors used to have to mark up physical pages or write comments in PDFs, but these days OUP uses online proofing tools, which means that authors can go in and make changes sort of almost directly into a kind of online version of their paper. And once you've submitted the corrections, the article will be revised and finalized, and then it will be published online. And that will either be directly into an issue, or it will be published on the advanced articles page of the journal's website. So if you have submitted to a journal which publishes accepted manuscripts, then your pre-typeset manuscript, so the raw version of your accepted manuscript, that might be a Word file, it will just be converted into PDF and then published as it is on the advanced articles page. And that will happen almost immediately after you've signed your license online. So although the paper is still not typeset and not finalized, it is an official publication with a DOI number, which means that it's searchable online and it can be cited from that point onwards. So if you're looking for a really fast route to publication, then selecting a journal which does this kind of publication model is a good way to go. And whatever the publication model, you'll receive an email from OUP immediately after the paper has been published online. And this includes a toll-free link. So this is a link that provides free access to your paper, the online version of your paper. And that link can be accessed even if you don't have a subscription to the journal it's been published in. And actually, we're very happy for authors to use this link to share it with colleagues and friends, kind of within reason. And it can even be used on an institutional web page as long as there is, it's not accessible from the general public. So OUP's journal publishing platform has a range of digital features which can help enhance the published paper. I already mentioned graphical and video abstracts. It's also possible to embed videos and 3D animations in the online version of the paper. And we can support things like audio abstracts as well. And we can also put links to video presentations which are related to the paper, like the one here on this slide. So another nice feature of the OUP platform is article level metrics, which are updated in real time. So metrics information is displayed for every single article published online. And you can see here on the right-hand side. And this includes the altmetrics score, the number of views, and the number of citations. And if you click on the link, the more metrics information link here, just below, you get a pop-up window. This window pops up with more detailed information, including a breakdown of the altmetrics score, the number of page views, the number of PDF downloads, usage over time, Web of Science citations, and Dimension citations. And you can click on these icons to go to the third-party website and see even more detailed info about the article. So it's a really useful and helpful way to track the performance and impact of your paper. But once your paper is published online, then that's not the end of the journey. OUP's marketing team does a lot of digital marketing and conference promotion, campaigns which are kind of done at a journal level or a subject level. But obviously it's not possible for us to individually market every single paper that is published. So this is why it's important for you as the author to promote your work and to get it out into the wider research community and wider world, and to make it as discoverable as possible. In Japan, I guess as a kind of cultural issue, Japanese researchers are not always comfortable about promoting themselves. But actually, there are simple things that you can do which can have a real kind of impact. And these last couple of slides show a few of the things you can do to promote your work after you have published it. So if you have limited time, so with just an hour or so, you can do some of these things. For example, include information about your article on your professional institutional profile. So if you have a profile on the university website, you can include a link, the DOI link, and the title. And this will really help with the search engine optimization because, as you may know, Google's algorithm prioritizes web pages which have links, external links on other trusted websites. So this is a really good way of boosting discoverability. You can create an email signature with a link to your article. You can share your article on any social media network that you currently use, so Facebook or Twitter. You can add it to your Twitter bio or LinkedIn bio. And actually, you can kind of make use of the journal's Twitter account. Sometimes journals have official Twitter accounts, so you can include that account's handle in your tweet so that followers of the journal account will see your paper. And finally, if you're teaching a class or a seminar, you can include your paper as in the reading list. If you have a little more time, there are some other things you can do. One thing which I think is very kind of effective is to create a slide about your paper, which you can include in any presentations you give on the topic or related topics. And the slide should include the title and the DOI, but you can also include things like key figures or graphical abstract or any other information. Some of these other things may or may not be possible depending on your institution, but it's worth finding out if you can list your paper on the university website or include it in an email newsletter, or if there's an alumni magazine, try and get it listed in there. And then for papers which are kind of really groundbreaking or have a very wide kind of application, you could consider doing a press release through your university. And that's something that OUP can support. So the production department can ensure that your paper publishes at a specific time to kind of match the time of the press release. And we also have our own Oxford Academic Twitter account. So for a paper which is being, for which a press release is being done, we will generally do a tweet on our OUP Twitter account, which highlights that press release. And then finally, we have an academic blog, which we have short articles written by academics on. Again, this doesn't happen very often on the journals I manage, I think only once in the last sort of 8 years or so. But if there's a paper that has a particularly interesting backstory or very kind of broad appeal, then writing a short blog article, publishing it on the OUP blog is a very good way to get the work known. So I've included links to the blog and the Twitter account, so please feel free to have a look and please follow the Twitter account. And that concludes my presentation for today. So thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions about the content or journals publishing in general, I'll be very happy to take them. Thank you very much.
네, 그 질문이 있으시면 그 앞에 버튼을 누르시고 마이크로 질문을 해주시면 되고요. 혹시 한국어로 질문을 해주시면 제가 최선을 다해서 통역을 해보도록 하겠습니다. 그리고 오늘 발표한 자료는 홈페이지를 통해서 게시하신다고 하니까 나중에 연락을 받아보실 겁니다. 오랜만에 학생의 입장에서 졸업한 지 너무 오래됐지만 들어봤는데 제가 하고 있는 비즈니스랑 좀 일맥상통하는 면이 많아서 굉장히 저도 인상 깊었던 시간이었던 것 같습니다. 그러면 질문 있으시면 해주시기 바랍니다.
Thank you for your presentation. And I was curious about the main role of corresponding author because the word corresponding is something ambiguous. For PhD students, I wrote my principal investigator as corresponding author, but after I get doctorate and I transfer from another institute, I may feel not sure about the role of corresponding author, and I want to hear about your
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. And I think it varies a bit between subject disciplines. So, I mean, in terms of the publishing process, the corresponding author is responsible for submitting the manuscript and for selecting the publishing license and for arranging payment of publication fees and for checking the proofs and everything. So it's a very important role in the publication process. And for that reason, depending on the discipline and also sometimes depending on the country, it can be a role which is taken by the most senior author, or it can be, you know, a kind of task which is given to the least senior sort of member of the author team. So I think in deciding who should be the corresponding author, you should really consider, you know, who has the time to kind of commit to doing the publication process, and it might not necessarily be the first author. So yeah, maybe number 2 or number 3 in the team, depending on how many there are of you.
So my question is, for early career researchers who haven't published an article before, compared to established researchers with a string of research output, is there something in particular that early career researchers should pay more attention to?
I think, yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of the things I talked about today are kind of applicable in particular to early career researchers, because obviously if you have an established name and you know, a list of papers to your name, then you're likely to be sort of, you know, you'll get interest from the reviewers and the editors just from who you are. But if you're starting out, then writing a good cover letter, paying attention to these kinds of things, like the figure presentation and the title and so on, I think it's really important, because you're really having at that point to sell your work in a way that perhaps a more established mid-career or late career researcher wouldn't have to do. I think also, sorry, just to add to that, I think selecting the journal as well is also important. You know, if you're an early career researcher, submitting a paper to Nature is probably not going to be, you know, worthwhile. So being realistic about, you know, which journals you're likely to get accepted in, and while at the same time, you know, considering, you know, what is the right journal for you. I think that's a good way to go.
So I just started my master's, so I'm a bit new to this whole thing, but how would you exactly identify the scope or the readership of a journal exactly?
Well, on the journal websites, they will have an about page where they will actually say what the scope of the journal is. So, you know, this journal accepts papers in these areas and we look for, you know, X, Y, and Z. So I think that's obviously a good place to start. Sometimes you can get more information on that kind of thing from the author guidelines as well. There'll be sort of you know, descriptions of article types that the journal accepts and what they're looking for in those article types. So I think those are good places to start. But also, you know, if you think about what journals you yourself read, you know, which journals publish you know, good papers in the field that you're working in, that's generally will give you an indication of what's suitable for you.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for the valuable tips for doing it in practice. And like you mentioned about the AI or the BARD or the ChatGPT, like that kind of thing. So we can get some advice or the minor tips for correcting our English or those kind of the progress of our writings, but still in the perspective of the authorship, like how we credit or just like a minor changes or like the ideas that we are using, like we are just using it instead of Googling it or the other forms of searching it. So like how can you just describe?
Yeah, and that is a very good question. Actually, I had a meeting with the editors of the Korean journal that we published last night, and we were talking about exactly this. And it was interesting. The editor was saying that there are tools for detecting whether a piece of text or a paper has been written by ChatGPT. It can kind of guess based on probability, has this been written by AI? But if you just use ChatGPT, as you mentioned, to just kind of improve the English, brush up the English here and there, then the tool doesn't detect it. So, I mean, I think it's kind of a gray area, and at this point, there haven't been kind of policies set by journals for all of these things. and there are kind of new uses coming through every time. So it's, at the moment, I don't think anyone has a specific policy about using ChatGPT to brush up English. And personally, I don't think that's necessarily a bad use of it. I know that when I translate Japanese, I sometimes rely on Google Translate. So I think if you're using it in a way which is, not, which is, I suppose, honest, then I can't necessarily see that there's a problem with that. But as I say, this is such a sort of emerging field that we don't really know at this stage whether that will be acceptable or considered acceptable in the future.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. What is the stand of OED on erratum and retraction of papers?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We actually have on our website, we have a kind of explanation of what our criteria are for issuing corrections. Generally, corrections are only issued in cases where the scientific content of the paper is compromised in some way by either a mistake by the author or a mistake by the publisher at the copy editing or typesetting stage. And for things like you missed off this comma or something like that, then we won't correct the paper. It also depends on how old the paper is. So if it's over a year old, then we will just publish a correction notice without correcting the paper itself. But if it's more recent, then we will correct the paper itself while also issuing a correction notice. For retractions, it's kind of a different sort of situation altogether. Retractions are all of our kind of ethical, dealing with ethical issues is based on the Committee on Publication Ethics, or COPE's guidelines. So COPE is the kind of the central organization that sets the kind of guidelines and sort of best practice for dealing with ethical issues in publication. So we always make sure that we stick to COPE's guidelines. And issuing retractions is something that is only really done if there is no other option. So if a paper is shown to be scientifically flawed, or the key data has been shown to be manipulated or falsified, and it can't be reproduced in a non sort of falsified way, then we will issue a retraction. But actually, if, for example, a figure in a paper was one that had been manipulated, but the same experiment could be repeated and a new figure used, then we will potentially issue a correction rather than retracting that paper. So I think the main thing is that we're concerned about making sure the scientific record is accurate and uncompromised, and it's not about punishing authors or just sort of immediately retracting if there's something slightly off with the paper. So it requires a lot of investigation, and it's time-consuming work for everyone.
Thank you for your tips. It was really useful information. But then I have a question that some of my acquaintances, or not that close friend, but some of the researchers tell their story that when they first submitted their paper, they got a letter that from the reviewers that they need to correct some of the points. So they did all of that, but then they got rejected. So it was not an instant rejection from the editor, but then they got the instructions for the revision, but then they rejected. And they told me that it is quite often case that this kind of thing happens. So I was wondering why this kind of thing happened, and why is it that they first accepted the manuscript, but then they rejected?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of an unfortunate thing that does sometimes happen. It shouldn't really happen, because if you address the points in the reviewers that the reviewers have raised, and you're able to, address them all sort of satisfactorily, then therefore you should be accepted. But it can sometimes happen that the papers are, when they are revised and resubmitted, they are then looked at by different reviewers. Generally, it's supposed to be the same reviewers, but sometimes it's a different set of reviewers. Maybe the original reviewers were not available. And then sometimes they may find something, you know, that the previous reviewers didn't, or they may, for whatever reason, not like the paper and decide to recommend a reject decision. I mean, without knowing the specifics, it's hard to know why, but this sort of thing does occasionally happen, unfortunately. I guess, yeah, and I mean, it does occasionally happen that the original reviews, maybe one reviewer was recommended to reject and the other reviewer recommended revision, and then the second time around, so the editor is kind of unsure which way to go, but they still go through the revision process, and then the second time around, they kind of make up their mind that they should reject it. You know, there are various different scenarios you can imagine, but yeah, it's not the way it's supposed to work, really.
For some cases, even though some journal suggest the transfer process, and what do you think of this transfer process, and what kind of advantages can we take?
Okay, yeah, so this kind of transfer, or sometimes it's called cascade, is something that is increasingly common, and a lot of the time it will be you know, a journal will launch a sister journal. Often that's an open access journal, or you know, a journal that is a subset of the main journal. So in the case of medical journals, sometimes they will have a case reports kind of sub-journal. And the main benefit of that sort of transfer process is that if the paper has been reviewed, then all of the review reports can be kind of sent along with the paper to the target journal. From the author's point of view, so that obviously helps the editors and the reviewers. From the author's point of view, not having to re-type in all of the information into the submission system, that is a big advantage. So what happens is, the paper goes immediately across to the other submission system. There may be a few things that you need to, a few additional bits of information you need to add, because different journals ask for different things. But it can save a lot of time, basically. It doesn't necessarily mean that the journal that you've been transferred to will accept your paper. That's obviously not a guarantee, but there is that kind of benefit.
네, 수고하셨고요. 그러면 오늘 세션은 여기서 마치도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.